Welcome to the third of our series, and the shift, a little bit of a shift from what we were doing for the last 2 weeks. We're going to do something a little different, and each night, this week will be even different from next week as well. So I've titled it The Church Yesterday and Today, but that was just in search of a title. But we're going to be launching a conversation about a consideration of the church of what it was in the beginning, starting in the United States, and what it's become today. Now, it was really circuitous how I came about doing what I wanted to do with this presentation. It all began with the realization that this was the year of my 50th high school reunion, which turned out to be a non-reunion, reminding me that our unofficial class motto has always been, never was so little accomplished by so many. But time went by and I had no word of the 50th reunion until through the grapevine I found out it had already happened. 9 people at somebody's backyard. But it did give me the opportunity to ponder over these last 50 years and how quickly they've gone by, and what was 1974 compared to 2024. But like boiling a frog, much in society has shifted, but it's been such a slow and steady movement that we have more or less adapted to the shift along the way. And this goes much further back than 50 years. For instance, there were things never considered 50 years ago, but are very much considered today. And I'm not talking about technology. The level of profanity and graphic sexuality used in the media today would not have been only unacceptable 50 years ago, but would have been a source of nationwide scandal and comment. Okay? Hollywood, however, had embraced it so wholeheartedly, and today there are almost no non-negotiables left. In 1974, the divorce rate was 19.3%, and that was considered scandalous. In 2024, the rate is 41%. In 1974, the cohabitation, that is, people living together without marriage, or what we usually refer to as shacking up, was only 11%. By 2024, that has risen to 64%. It's actually considered normative. And many people think, of course, you live together before you get married. That's now considered normative. Now, I'm also not talking about economy, politics, or global warming, as critical and essential as those are. But it's a movement into a kind of societal subjectivity that has no historic precedent. And the church, as an American institution, has morphed significantly over the past 150 years due to those sociological factors that I want to take a little time to explore, as I think they do shed some light on the issues that we do face today. Now, this is not a history of the Catholic Church in the United States. I've already done that one. But in some aspects of that history, it's critical that we take a look at it for our understanding of our situation today. But before considering them, I'd like to offer an observation. As a child, growing up in the 60s, I had a vision of the future that did not play out as expected. And it was all set for me in television. Now, some of you who are of a certain age will remember the lineup on the weeknights. And on Wednesday night, I would be parked with Mother's famous and well-prepared Swanson frozen dinner in front of me to watch Lost in Space. Because here was this family who had been launched off to another planet to populate that planet because the Earth was in such bad shape in that far, far, far away year 1997. And I imagine, as a child, what is 1997 going to look like? Well, what did I think? It's going to look like Lost in Space. Or a few years later, it's going to look like Star Trek, right? So that's led me to a consideration to think about that. Because I didn't think we would have horrible diseases anymore. I was sure all that was going to be gone. We would have already colonized the moon, surely, by 1997. Had regular exploratory missions to other planets. We'd be scooting around in those little airborne bubbles like George Jetson. Then there were those things I never considered because I thought they would never change. Like church. Like morality. Like belief. And so on. And then, naive and immature teenager that I was, I lacked the intellect to imagine that progress is not always synonymous with improvement. Which has led me to explore a couple of questions I felt were worth considering in the context of our reality. Now, looking back 50 years, I recall a small town when meeting a new person, among the very first few questions anyone asked would be, "What church do you go to?" The assumption being that virtually everyone went to church. And on my street they did. Methodists, Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Church of Christ. By the way, those are all College Station churches in the picture, the ones I could find. And even those mysterious people who never cut their lawn and went to the Christian Science church. Okay? I mean, as a youngster, I remember driving by their house and hearing my mother say, "Now they go to the Christian Science church and I don't want you playing with their kids." And I asked why, and whereupon she said, "Well, if I was left at their house and got hurt, they wouldn't take me to the doctor." Which didn't make any sense to me until later on when I found out they don't believe in blood transfusions or, I don't know, whatever else Christian scientists do or do not do, or in their weird religion. But why was the perpetual question I asked. Why? I was at that stage of development. And she would say, "Well, because that's what their religion teaches. They don't believe in doctors." And then I said, "Well, do they believe in Santa Claus?" And she said, "I suppose they do, or their children do, but what does that have to do with it?" And I said, "I don't understand. I've never seen Santa Claus, but I still believe in him. And Dr. Lindsay, who is our physician, Dr. Lindsay lives next door, and we see him every day. How come they don't believe what they see?" The logic of a child. They don't believe in doctors. Dr. Lindsay lives next door. When I had poison ivy, he gave me a steroid shot. So, I mean, that's real. Okay, so I didn't get it. But it's at this point that parental patience quota for the day had been met. And the only response I could remember is, "Because that's the way things are, honey. Now go and do your homework, but take out the trash first." So as a result of that unsatisfying conversation, I was bitten by a bug that prompted a lifelong interest in ecumenism, which is another story for another time. In the early 60s, church-going was a national thing. It was important. It was considered important enough to actually dress up for, and actually to be on time for. There was a sense of the appropriate that meant that no one would dream of appearing at church dressed in sandals, shorts, gym clothes, or a t-shirt, which you can count on today. The house of God was not a public convenience. Now, I suppose if anybody were to use the phrase Sunday best these days, no one would know what you were talking about. Across the board, there was still an atmosphere of morality, at least in the public forum, although Hollywood was always pushing the boundaries. My mother's cousin insisted that they go see a movie. It was called The Night of the Iguana. Now, they wanted to go see it because it was filmed where my grandmother's house was outside of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. They went to the movie. Mother came back horrified, said she would never ever step foot in a movie theater again, and she never did. Never did. Now, I've seen it on TV, and I kept waiting for the part that was... And I realized I have been so inured by society that I don't even think about how scandalous that was in the 1960s. It's like the boiling frog. We get inured to something. And there was a sense of co-responsibility that even the media promoted. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but on TV, there would always be a thing, remember to attend the church of your choice. That used to be very common in the 1960s. It would be around the time of late night news, and the TV announcer would say, "It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are?" Yeah. You remember that one? Yeah. Nobody cares where your children are anymore. All right? Can you imagine hearing that today? This was our reality 50 years ago. And our neighborhood on Sunday morning, we all left our driveways about the same time. The next door neighbors and the folks across the street from them went to A&M United Methodist Church. The people across the street went to St. Thomas Episcopal Church. The other neighbors went to First Presbyterian. At least 4 other families on our street attended St. Mary's with us. And if we were good at church, we all met at Shipley's afterwards. Okay? If not, we got home and got the belt. That seemed to have gone away too. But all the churches were full on Sunday. Lots of my friends went to church twice on Sunday. I asked Dad one time, I said, why don't we go to church both on Sunday and Wednesday night like the Sorensens do, our back door neighbors? And his response is, we have Holy Communion and they didn't. It didn't make sense to me, so he elaborated. He says, we have Jesus in Holy Communion, and that fills us up with Jesus for a whole week. And then he said, they don't have Holy Communion, and their ministers just talk the whole time between songs. And it doesn't seem that they have enough time to say anything that they want to say, so they have to come back later that night and continue to say it, and then come back on Wednesday so they can finish saying it. He then said that we have Jesus in the sacrament and they don't, which is why they have to go so often. And with that piece of astonishing sacramental and comparative ecclesiology, I was satisfied for the time being. And then prided myself by relaying this to my Baptist friends, who I am given to understand felt it necessary to bring to their parents with the hopes that they would cease their repetitious and fruitless efforts and immediately join the Catholic Church. All this to say here is, there's a certain age. We'll recall at one time we had, as a society, a very church-going mentality. Those days are over. At least how we knew them, they're over. Now, I'd venture to guess that very few people here know where their neighbors worship, if they worship at all. And if indeed they attend worship anywhere and all, chances are they don't attend what was once referred to as a standard brand church. Okay? Sunday morning, we'll find them in any one of 100 different variants that go under the name of, hello, I forgot Chipley's Donuts, non-denominational. Statistics tell us that lots of people simply don't go to church anymore or even believe there is a God. The origins of non-denominational churches can be found in the general dissatisfaction that people found in their name brand churches. Non-denominational Christianity first arose in the 20th century, but much further back than you think. It really starts in the 1920s, and it's in little pockets. But the most famous one was the Angelus Temple in Los Angeles. Is anybody here from LA or from Southern California? Okay. Well, it's still there. But it was started by a woman named Amy Semple McPherson. Have you ever heard of her? And she would put the mega church pastors today to shame, especially with some of her antics, one of which was faking her kidnapping. in order to gain some more publicity. But she had about 11,000 people in worship on Sunday. And out of Angela's temple, they would feed the homeless somewhere up around 100,000 a week, which is a staggering statistic. But it begins there in a general dissatisfaction with mainline Christianity. When I say mainline Christianity, I'm talking about Protestantism. And the reason for establishing a particular non-denominational church depends largely on the ideas and the circumstances of its founders. Because non-denominational churches usually lean toward the title non-denominational for very good reasons. For instance, non-denominational Christianity might follow a particular sect or theological stance like Calvinism and its traditions and beliefs, but would differentiate from your typical Presbyterian church by having its own rules and not strictly adhering to the structure of the broader organization. In other words, we like the theology, we don't like the politics. Okay? And that's how so many of these non-denominational churches get started. You've all heard of Austin Stone? Okay, it's not non-denominational. It's rebranded Baptist. The whole thing comes out of Nashville and the Southern Baptist Convention and is funded out of Nashville. But it's a Baptist church. But it's not your grandmother's Baptist church. So that's exactly how they advertise themselves. And this kind of independence then allows non-denominational Christianity to set themselves not only free from their political alliances of that denomination, but also to establish a little more relaxed church structure. And so with no oversight from any particular sect or denomination's leadership, the non-denominational church can adapt and adjust based on the needs and the desires of its congregation and community, and then discard any traditions or ideas that they deem as obsolete. They'll mimic mainline churches in some ways, but differ from them in a few key matters that deter them from becoming in any way associated with Methodism, Presbyterian, Baptist, or what have you. For example, as I said, there are non-denominational churches that would essentially be Southern Baptist, except they allow women to preach. The Southern Baptist Convention, even at their latest meeting, reaffirmed that women do not belong in the pulpit. Okay? So using the word non-denominational plays into what I would call a general dissatisfaction of mainline organized Protestantism. And most particularly those with limited Christian theological understanding. So hence the proliferation of uncatechized Catholics joining these groups is a case in point. And so using the term non-denominational allows these groups to reach a larger audience and attract people with negative views of traditional religion or any other religious tradition. Okay. And it's often an appealing option for members of mainline denominations who disagree with that church's outlook on certain matters. And like with the millennials and the Gen Zs who dislike the formality of mainline churches and their rigid traditions and to a certain degree their doctrines. It's really common these days for these largest of groups to have very conservative views and adhering to various degrees of biblical fundamentalism. But one thing virtually all of them have in common is the personality pastor. It's a very common experience that when the first generation pastor leaves, or as is so often the case, is asked to leave, or as in some cases is indicted, okay, the successor then struggles to steer the boat through those troubled waters, and many large non-denominational campuses end up on the market. All of these are in the Metroplex. big campuses established probably less than 20 years ago, now abandoned and up for sale. Nevertheless, these groups are growing while others are not. Now, over the last decade, Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, every other Protestant family has declined except those who say they are non-denominational. The 2020 U.S. Census tallied 4,000 more non-denominational churches than in 2010. 4,000 more. And non-denominational church attendance rose by 6.5 million during that time. At the same time, mainline Protestant Christianity is collapsing, following 5 decades of decline. In the mid-1970s, nearly a third of Americans were affiliated with denominations like the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, so on. But now, just 1 in 10 Americans are part of the mainline tradition. In the General Social Survey, Americans are asked about the religion they were raised in and now their current tradition. And this was a time when mainline traditions struggled for decades to retain believers that were born into their churches. In the 1970s, about 3/4 of those raised in mainline churches would still belong to mainline churches as adults. In the 2010s, the share of those who stayed mainline had declined to just over half. And the Catholic Church saw the largest decline in religious affiliation of any religious group in 2023. Some 30% of Americans said they grew up as Catholics. Only 20% continue to identify that way today. And another survey shows religiously unaffiliated Americans are the only group that has seen steady growth over the past decade, from 21% of all Americans in 2013 to 26% in 2023. These unaffiliated Americans, many of whom abandoned their childhood faith, are not looking for a spiritual home. Only 9% of the people of this group said they were looking for religion, and they're saying, I'm looking for a religion that's right for me. Okay. Only 3% of Americans who grew up without a religious identity said they joined a religion. Even those who remain religious, the vast majority of Americans, about 67% of whom are Christian, say that religion is less important in their lives. Only 53% say religion is the most important or one among many important things in their lives in 2023, compared to 72% in 2013. We're talking 10 years. Of the 45% of the mainline who leave, some end up in evangelical congregations. However, the evangelical share did not increase between the 1980s and the 2010s. Instead, the bigger story is that portion of those who leave the main line and become a nun. And I'm not talking about a sister. They become the religious nun, claiming no faith, no tradition in particular. And that has tripled since the 1970s. From 6% to nearly 20%. That's the most recent data. Thus, there is a lot of evidence that the rise of non-denominationals is being directly fueled by the decline of the mainline. People in non-denominational churches are actually becoming less likely to even have had a mainline background as the number of mainline believers declines. About 22% come from the mainline in the 1970s compared to 10% over the decade before. And by the way, mainline always refers to the railway. If you've heard mainline all your life, mainline Christianity, it refers to a railway that connects New York City to Philadelphia. It was called the main line, the railroad. And those churches that located themselves along the railway were called the main line, in reference to their position near the tracks. And all of those tended to be major brand Protestant churches of the day, particularly Congregational, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Methodist, to a much lesser degree, Lutheran, Unitarians, which would later become Unitarian Universalists. That was pretty much it. Yet the portion of people who were raised in the Catholic faith and identify now as non-denominational as adults is growing dramatically. In the 1970s, just 6% of non-denominationals were converted Catholics. Today, that number has tripled to 17%. Thus, there is a much larger Catholic to non-denominational pipeline than there is from mainline to non-denominational. Another reason is that non-denominational groups are on the rise, as while other traditions are struggling with their membership, is their focus on very elaborate and well-funded children's programming and programming for youth. Parents will go where their children are engaged. For example, the budget for Austin Stone for children is 5 times our budget at this church, our total budget. Total budget, which by the way is $7 million. That's across the board in Austin Stone. It's a denomination that pulls in about $45 million a year in an offering. Okay. Whereas in the 1980s, just 2% of people were raised in a non-denominational church compared to the 7% who were raised Southern Baptist, 5% raised in the United Methodist. And all those percentages have shifted over the last 40 years. Now, a young person is just as likely to be raised in a non-denominational church as in any one of the main lines. Like 4% were being raised in the United Methodist, which now is split. They are no longer the United Methodist Church. They've split into various factions, the deciding factors being the same as pretty much all the other denominations. So, what is the driving growth of non-denominational churches? Now, it's very easy to say that dissatisfaction with the turmoil within mainline Protestantism is a root cause. But that, however, would not square with the statistics. Now, while in the past, it did result from a significant proportion of individuals leaving a mainline tradition, now it looks like non-denominational congregations are increasing by taking in people who were raised as Roman Catholics, and particularly immigrant Roman Catholics, which is about a quarter of the general population. Why? Well, there's not one easy answer, but there is, however, an increase in young people choosing not to believe in anything due to the kinds of cultural influences characterized by people like Christopher Hitchin. But let's look at the dilemma, because here's an all too common situation. That's playing out. Jenny was baptized and raised Catholic. Jenny's family was not very involved in the church. They may have gone to Mass every other week, every third week, every fifth week, perhaps. They still considered themselves active Catholics. They seldom, if ever, went to confession and saw the church as an also run. But Jenny never felt any connection to God while attending Mass or catechism class, etc. As an adult, she had a friend who belonged to a non-denominational church and who invited her to join her. And for the first time in Jenny's life, she felt the presence of God. Now let's stop right there. Most likely, this person stopped attending church as a college student and began attending church with her friends or with one of the various campus groups, Campus Crusade for Christ, Young Life, any of those that are very good about attracting young people. And it's a very positive experience for them. Then she meets a boy through the experience. Then comes marriage. But before that, that's when the conflict begins. The Reformation, in all its horror, is revisited in the living room. Now, first of all, there's no one place in which to lay blame. For example, I've known very observant families where faith is at the very center of the home, where people went to Mass every Sunday, and one or more children, for whatever reason, are led off the reservation. Now, this is generally the result of an undue influence of a fiancé or a spouse who is not Catholic but has a very strong connection to their Protestant faith and has influence at a time when the Catholic partner has become largely uninvolved. So there's no guarantee that being a faithful and involved church-going family will ensure that the children will not seek what they perceive as greener grass, okay? It is statistically proven, however, that if the father is not committed and involved as a disciple, that is not seen as the religious leader of the household, the chances are far greater that the children will fall away. And by involved, it's more than just going to church. If the dad does not actively participate, boys will invariably follow suit. And I've told more than one dad who doesn't like singing in church that perhaps it's a sacrifice he might think of making. Because when the boy looks up at dad and dad's not doing anything, okay, not even following along, the boy goes, well, I believe that dad's right and everything else, so this must be right to do. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to participate either. And then everybody's really surprised when the kid decides he's not going to participate in his faith. From the perspective of the parish, and by extension, the diocese, it has been a mixture of issues. The first being the significant changes of religious comparison, especially in the 1950s. And another is culture. Catholicism in America began as an extension of culture. Whether you were Latin American, German, Irish, Eastern European, Italian, what have you. For the first couple of hundred years of American Catholic history, all the Catholics stuck to themselves, and for good reason. Language, culture, protection from prejudice, and so on. And with that kind of isolationism, it was very easy for Catholics to remain as such, especially as their clergy also came from the old country and did not encourage enculturation. By all means, learn English, but stick with your own. 100 years ago, a mixed marriage was when an Italian Catholic married an Irish Catholic. What happened? Well, Catholics eventually became part of the mainstream. Catholics left the ghetto and joined the American dream, and that dream being wealth and success. Catholic parents sent their children to public schools, and before long you had religious education classes for the publics, as these students were called. And long before this, however, the seeds had already been sown for the abandonment of what I call domestic Catholicism. And whether we like this fact or not, the vast majority of Catholics who immigrated to the United States were either semi-literate or completely illiterate. This was particularly true of the Irish, who were so desperate for a new life, free from the unbelievable cruel tyranny of the British. And the same could be said for Eastern Europeans. These cultures they left behind, for the most part, was a Catholic culture. They left the norm. Everybody was that. Okay? It was only the Germans and Czechs who brought evangelical Lutheranism. And they had long ago learned how to avoid each other in the old country. So they were very successful avoiding each other in the new country. Within just a few generations, Catholics were cheek to jowl with dozens of conflicting religious ideologies, the likes of which had no comparison in Europe. Not only that, religion in the home had been replaced by religion in the parochial school. What the children learned in the parochial school was a dry catechism without any real application. They would come home. Dad was tired, bone tired, from working a job that two people wouldn't even work today. And a mother who was dead tired of taking care of 3 or 4 kids. So do you think there was a lot of joy? Probably not. At home, mother and dad had survived another grueling day, putting food on the table and they led perpetually exhausted lives. And not surprisingly, the private home devotions were maintained, but they began to die out in the mid-20th century, only to become completely obsolete by the 1960s. So how then is the church to blame? Well, as an institution, the parish was not equipped for supporting Christian education on a scale experienced in Protestant churches. The Catholic parish plant would consist of a church, a rectory, a convent, and a school. By the time the Second Vatican Council came through, both convents and schools emptied at a dramatic rate. Parochial schools could not compete with public schools on any level, whether academic or in extracurricular activities and sports. The funding just wasn't there. The religious faculty were not as well educated as their secular counterpoints, and the curriculum was often decades out of date. The only exception to this were those schools operated outside of the parochial system, run by religious orders, and specifically by those orders who existed for no other reason than to educate, like the Jesuits. Many religious orders in large cities had very good schools, but they were also very much the exception to the rule. And these were entirely limited to very large urban areas and those who could afford it. Parents who wanted their kids to go to college and recognized that they had to have a more religious program either opted for one of these schools if available, or they could afford them, or they simply sent their kids to public schools. My parents, as I recall, recognized the absolute inferiority of the education of the parochial school in Bryan and put me in public schools. All of us went to public schools because they were horrified by what they witnessed. School books that were 20 and 30 years old, referring to presidents that had been dead for decades. Okay? But beyond good handwriting and the ability to read, testing scores of Catholic schools all fell behind. But let's back up just a little bit. In the first decades of the 19th century, the few Catholic schools that did exist often received public support. There was public funding, typically from local governments. But as concern over government aid to religious institutions, and that coupled with anti-immigrant sentiment, these arrangements all came to an end. And they also played a part in the emergence of government-funded common schools, which is the predecessor of today's public school system. They were designed to counter what some saw as objectionable influences. And now what the main line of people called objectionable influences is just another word for immigrants. Religious and ethnic diversification and urbanization. And to provide a standard education to all students. Those common schools aim to advance both education and assimilation. There is a fiction today about Catholic colleges. One of the worst academic rated colleges in the United States was Notre Dame, and remained so well into the 1950s. Most Catholic schools, especially those not run by the Jesuits, had very, very poor academic standards. And everybody knew it. Anyway, these public schools, they're going to grow rapidly. They enroll significant numbers of children. And Catholic schools were growing as well. In the decades prior to the Civil War, there were only 200 Catholic schools nationwide. That's it. But the immigrants, this wave of immigrants that was swept into America in the second half of the 19th century, in the first decades of the 20th century, is going to have major implications for American education and particularly for Catholic schools. Let's take, by the way, this didn't come out as well. These are pages from a popular American magazine a political magazine that often would lampoon Catholic nuns and clergy trying to get money from the government for their schools, stuff like that. Let's take a quick break and then we'll come back together. Nearly all the approximately 17 million immigrants who entered the United States between 1850 and 1900 came from Europe. And many from, again, predominantly Catholic countries like Italy and Ireland. By the turn of the 20th century, America had become 16% Catholic. During this era, anti-immigrant bigotry spread and intensified, and in some places received a government imprimatur. Nebraska and Hawaii passed legislation restricting schools' ability to teach foreign languages. Illinois and Wisconsin enacted laws banning any education in foreign languages, thus effectively dismantling the state's German, Catholic, and Lutheran parochial schools. No school could teach in a foreign language. Oregon passed laws requiring students to attend public schools, a direct assault on the rights of families, Catholics or otherwise, to educate their children as they saw fit. So you think it's difficult now. At the federal level, the former Speaker of the House, James Blaine, introduced a constitutional amendment in the year 1875 that would have strictly forbidden any government funding of schools run by any religious sect. Because Bible reading was often mandatory in public schools, always from a Protestant Bible, and some textbooks contained anti-Catholic material. And across the nation, these developments convinced many Catholics that their sons and daughters required schools of their own. In 1884, at the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, bishops required all parishes to establish schools, all parishes, and required all Catholic parents to have their children attend them. But the waves of immigrants that swept to American shores in the second half of the 19th century and through those few decades of the 20th are going to have major implications for American education, and particularly for Catholic schools. Now, Catholic schools were built and populated at a remarkable rate. In 1875, there had been fewer than 1,500 Catholic schools in America. By 1930, thanks to the support for Catholic education from Rome, that number increased to 10,000. In 1930, there were 10,000 Catholic schools. Between 1941 and 1960, non-public school enrollment that was driven by Catholic schools grew by 117%. When it reached its zenith by the mid-1960s, the nation's Catholic K through 12 education system maintained more than 13,000 schools, serving more than 5 million Catholic children. Approximately 12% of all American students. And most of these schools were in America's cities, and they rivaled public schools in size, particularly in the older cities in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, such as Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, St. Louis. And some of these were big. And some of them were ginormous. It was not unusual for a Catholic school to have as many as 3,000 students. But you would have a classroom with between 50 and 75 per classroom. Now, in these areas, Catholic schools represented a huge portion of the primary and secondary education system. For example, in 1960, approximately 360,000 students attended New York City's Catholic schools. 37% of the average daily public school attendance. The swiftness of Catholic schools' rise in the first half of the 20th century makes even more remarkable what followed, which is their even faster decline in the decades after. Hundreds of schools closed in the second half of the 1960s. And any new schools that opened failed to make up the difference. And a number of forces conspired to bring about the change. So one has to ask the question, if in the 1950s Catholicism had reached such a point in which the schools were so dramatically large, with such enormous enrollment, what happened? There had to have been a catalyst. And next week we're going to explore these in quite some depth as we begin to explore how World War II affected the Catholic Church in the United States. And affected Catholicism, affected really all of sociology of the United States after World War II. We're going to look at how the movement of World War II of humanity from urban centers to suburban centers is going to have a major impact on the life of Catholics. But backing up a little bit is the issue of what happened to the Catholic home. What happened when there were no Catholic schools per se, but there was no shortage of active Catholics? Because there is a narrative out there today that if you're going to have your Catholic students, you've got to send them to Catholic schools. That almost became a narrative that was promoted, and it's still very much promoted today. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't work. I would say probably 45 to 60% of the 8th grade students in this Catholic school do not believe in God, and will tell you so. Because there's no God in their homes for the most part. All you have to do is look at how society has responded to the decline of religion, and parents have to make decisions. Are we going to go along with that, or are we not? My kid is in soccer. He's been in soccer since he was 4 years old. His soccer games are on Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock. What do? Saturday. You take him to your soccer games. That's what the Catholic families do. All right? Now, some of them may go to Mass at 5 o'clock on Saturday. But what message have they sent the child?
It's not a priority.
No, your soccer is the most important thing. So we're going to, thank goodness, the church now has Mass on Saturday. We'll go to that and, quote, unquote, get that out of the way. That's reality. That is the narrative that's alive and well today. And it's not that, it's everything. Institutions that would have never had any kind of activities on Wednesday nights 50 years ago, that's long gone. An interesting study is to look at what goes on in Mormonism in Salt Lake City. I think this is a fascinating study, because what you have here is a religion, albeit an odd religion, but a religion that is 95% lived in the home and in the family. Not only do they go to church on Sunday morning, they go to church on Wednesday night, but beyond that, on Monday night, they have what's called family night. And that's where everybody stays home. If you go to Salt Lake City, there are no games on Monday nights. There is nothing on Monday nights. Place is crickets. Everybody's at home having dinner, playing games. It's not a religion. It's a time to be family together. And it is sacrosanct. They have made the decision to have an intentional family life. Now, it's also interesting that They don't have a parochial school system. But because of the nature of the population, the school system has made it possible for the boys to attend seminary in the afternoons. So once you are in high school, all Mormon boys, and they call it seminary, but what it is, it's training that will lead them to their mission. Because as most of you know, Mormon boys and now Mormon girls are now permitted. They go on a 2-year mission. It's like being in the Israeli army. At a certain age, or in Switzerland, you're going to go and do your service. This is the service you give to the church. You don't even get to decide where you go. The Mormon church will decide your kid is going to Nicaragua or France or Iowa. And they send them off for 2 years. 2 years in which they do not go home. They don't come home for Christmas. They don't come home for their birthdays. And they don't visit you. It is a time completely away. Now, I have no sympathy for Mormonism. But I have a fascination for a religion that has captivated people to such a degree that it hangs on and it becomes central to their lives. And I believe that is one of the greatest shifts that happened with immigration beginning in the middle 1800s. When Catholics came to the United States, and I'll talk about this next week, and ghettoized. How many of you are from a big northeast, eastern city like Detroit? Where are you from?
New York.
New York, that's a classic.
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh.
New York.
New York. Anybody? Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So you know very well that the city was divided into the Irish neighborhoods, the German neighborhoods, Eastern European neighborhoods, Greek, so on, Italians. And if you wanted Italian food, you went to the Italian neighborhood. If you wanted, nobody ate Irish. Nobody comes home and says, I feel like Irish tonight.
My grandmother made a good leg of lamb with me.
Well, it's like Canadian. Who has come home and said, do you feel like Canadian tonight? No, it's like, no. So it was very cultural. And this was survival. Because these neighborhoods, everybody spoke the language, they had the culture, and they had the parish church. If you're from New York or Pittsburgh, you've probably experienced driving down a street and there are 2 Catholic churches across the street from one another. Because each one behind it was one ethnic neighborhood, behind the other was another ethnic neighborhood. And these are big 1,000-seat churches. But that street was the division. Because everybody in that church was Lithuanian or Polish. Everybody in this church was Italian or Irish. Never the twain shall they meet. All right? And that was multiplied over and over and over again. And this was how it survived. But it wasn't about religious survival. It was about cultural survival, how we get along. And the influences were the ones out there, not from within. We're here to embrace the American dream. And so we will see a shift in Catholicism from the first generation to the second generation to the third generation. And it's by the third generation that we begin to see where it breaks down. And the 2 things that do happen that make the biggest difference, World War I and World War II. Because in both of those instances, for the first time, Irish and Germans and Poles and Czechs and Slavs and Lithuanians and Italians fought side by side under one flag. And that created a whole new reality. And I'm going to get into that more, but we'll talk about a little bit about that next week. But the point I want to get back to is all this was planting the seeds for the abandonment of religion in the home. How many of you grew up where every night the family said the rosary together? 1, 2. 1, 2. 100 years ago, it would have been everybody. How many of you grew up in a family in which you had the family prayers together, like the prayers of the Sacred Heart? Okay. You grew up in Indianapolis, and you had to go.
Chicago was my
Okay.
dad. They were.
Same thing, Chicago. St. Louis, Chicago, Indianapolis, all those, one after another after another. That's gone, isn't it? All of that is gone. It morphed into the Christmas Easter thing. That was the only time we saw ourselves as a unit. We denigrated to that. So, and that's why I wrote the book that I wrote. How many of you have read it so far and have taken it to heart? No, that's not nearly enough. If you want, they're free. I have more copies in here if anybody wants them. The future of the church is not to be found in the institution. It is to be found within families and in homes. And if the church is going to grow and change, it has to begin with the families together, not with father preaching. Vocations do not come from committees. The diocese, every diocese on earth, insists that parishes form vocation committees. Vocations do not emerge from committees, they emerge from families. A committee does not promote a vocation. If we want more lawyers, we don't put together a committee to promote more lawyers. Like, God forbid that we would ever need to do that. But you see what I'm getting at. All right, I'm specifically leaving an open time for some questions for tonight and to lead this conversation, because I think I've opened up a lot of windows here. Does anybody have any? Yes, Sean.
There was a slide before the break where you had a Balkan diagram. One of the figures was 32% thought religion led to mental issues. Could you elaborate on that?
It was. This was reasons that people gave for leaving religion, and so 32% said it was bad for their mental health. For some reason or another, they attributed whatever mental problems they had to their religious upbringing, which is very possible, given because that word Catholic guilt doesn't come from nowhere. Okay. It's the cousin of Jewish guilt, right? So that is one. It has an asterisk, and I'm trying to remember what the asterisk referred to. I'll have to find that out, Sean. But that's a reason. So this is a polling, and that was a reason that people gave. You'll see that the largest percentage in 2023 was people who simply stopped believing in what the religion teaches. I'm going to talk next week about one of the biggest issues that has brought up the whole idea of the year of the Eucharist, which is founded on the fact that there was a poll, and it was not a very good one either, because I don't think it was. The problem with polling, and I've had an awful lot of experience with the Pew Trust, and I know lots of people there, because when I was the president of the TCC, we did a lot of Pew research stuff for the Catholic Church in the United States. You can make a poll say anything you want it to say. Anybody who's in politics knows this very, very well. It depends on how you phrase the questions, okay? And so the questions were phrased in a way that people gave an answer that could be construed in multiple ways. But the question was, is Jesus truly present in the Eucharist? And that's a leading question. And the question is yes, but is it symbolic or is it real? This would become the Scylla and the Charybdis. Which one am I going to beat myself to death on? So next week we're going to look at how it was never defined in the first 1,000 years of the church. So I'm not getting into that right now, but it's very clear that's the largest one. Is people, they don't know what the church teaches, but they know they don't agree with what they don't know. Okay. There has been a tremendous juvenilization of society. That's the only way I can phrase it. We have become a juvenilized society. We've started not giving up on the "it's not fair" that 13 to 18-year-olds have. It's not fair. No, it's not fair. That doesn't matter. Life is not fair. So we want equity, we want everything. So like, for instance, the 47% who have negative beliefs about the treatment of gay and lesbian people. Okay? Because it's not fair the way the church treats people. Okay? Well, it isn't about fairness. We don't poll people, decide what they like, and build a religion on that. But that is exactly what non-denominationalism does, okay? And so you'll find the rest of them are getting quite a bit smaller than that. But thanks for bringing that up. Anybody else? Doctor?
Ministries like Word on Fire are bringing some of the nuns back. Is there any data on that?
I don't have data about, there's so many really good efforts out there in the social media to reach out to Catholics. What has been more successful, I think, than that is one-to-one. It's always relational. Reaching out to somebody saying, hey, would you like to come and see what we do together? And people witness that. And then they find community. Religion without community doesn't work. Cenobitic religion, Cenobitic monks who live in hermits, okay? They're very religious, but they're cranky as hell. Okay, I know this because I know some hermits, and you get your face bit off if you're not careful around them. They're so charitable. But community is essential. And if you have a community of like-minded people and beliefs, then people are attracted to that. And then they're brought in. This is the success of non-denominationalism, because they're across the board. Non-denominationalism is fueled by small group relational ministry. A group of 5-6 couples who meet on a regular basis, get to know one another, support each other in their daily lives, become an extended family, if you will. And they are also a small faith community. And it's enormously successful. And in some instances, and a lot of times, they will actually break away and form their own little churches. Now, the problem with this is they're worshiping their relationships. Their relationships have become their religion. And that's the issue. I'll get into some of that later. Thank you, John.
I'm not familiar with your book.
I think there's some in here. I'll check. Let me look. They're in a box. I think they got given away. They may have gotten given away. We pull them out for Catalyst on Wednesday mornings, but they do tend to disappear.
There were some in the back of the church.
They're available in the back of the church. You can find, I think they've all... It's just a little bitty book. It's called Our Faith, Our Home. Our Home, Our Church. Our Home, Our Church. It's about reclaiming the domestic church. It's what I did with my free time during COVID. There's some in the narthex. Just go in and grab one. Mert.
I have a basic comment. You were addressing the immigrants that come to America. This is what I see. They're on their own. So my brother was a high school principal, middle school principal for 40 years. He just retired. These kids are sent to school, and they're just kind of given to the teachers. You educate them. You figure this out. The parents, some of them don't even speak English, and so they're kind of at the mercy. That separation. They can't really participate in the system, so their kids are kind of on their own. And I think that's another thing that's going to really affect their religion, whatever religion is they're bringing. English wasn't my first language, and so my parents didn't speak English. And so when I moved here, I was on my own. So you do get sucked into the culture of whatever's around you.
Right.
They left their country because of religion. They were persecuted for...
Many immigrants in the 19th century left because of religious persecution.
They did.
Especially in Germany, especially the Lutherans. And they were being persecuted by other Lutherans.
Right. So, I don't know. I think that's going to be an interesting situation with as much immigration as we have now. Coming into America and not having a way to communicate.
What worked in the 19th century was just the sheer numbers. When you have enough coming in, they're able to create community. Now if you have just little handfuls here and handfuls there, and then we have not evolved as human beings in the United States very much, and we treat immigrants today as badly as we treated them in the 19th century. Because they're not us, and they eat our dogs. Okay. I mean, now, as odd as that sounds, the narratives that were coming out against immigrants in the 19th century were really no better than that. Do you want to live next to an Irish? They're all drunks. They're always going to create a narrative that has nothing to do with reality. And there would be something like that for each one. The horrors to which they were subjected. If you've ever read the book by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, if you haven't, I suggest you do, but don't eat afterwards. Really it's a story of Chicago around the turn of the century, and it's very much how the immigrants are treated. We'll use them for their ability to do the work we don't want to do. But we will make certain that they have nothing to do with us other than that. And they'll only get enough sustenance in order to keep them alive. Anyway, thank you, Mert, bringing that up. Donna.
This is probably off point, but can you talk a little bit about the reemergence of prosperity gospel? You had a picture of Joel Osteen at one point. And that's not new. I mean, back in the 20s and 30s, they had, whether it was Drum and Ike and, Sweet Dick. I mean, they have a whole lot of Protestant, God wants you to be rich as the main focus. Is that for another night or?
Well, I mean, it's and the problem is there's so many different quote unquote prosperity gospels. Never underestimate the ability for somebody to use religion for profit. And the problem is there were great, I want to call them mega preachers, who were not, I wouldn't call them, I would call their motives good, but so often their success tainted their motives. Amy Semple McPherson is a case in point. She became a superstar. She actually would follow the Ziegfeld Follies on the theater circuit. This is in the 1920s. So she would get it, you would go to the movies, but before the movies there would be a stage show or a dog act or dog and pony show is what they used to call them, or something like that. Well, she would be included, she would do her little stint, her little preaching stint in the Palace or the Pantages or Lowe's or whatever the name of the theater was in the town. And she went around doing that. She was really the progenitor of that sort of thing. And eventually, her handlers saw profit in that. And said, you need to say a little more like what you said last night because the take was so much better. Okay?
Did you get into like healings and things like that?
No, then you're going to get into Billy Sunday. And that's going to morph into probably the most famous one of the 20th century, which was Oral Roberts, who started his school in Tulsa. That was the beginning of, if you give us money, we'll give you something in return. And that giving us money is going to guarantee you this blessing. The worst of that was Robert Tilton out of Dallas. And he would ask you to put your hand on the television set. And then he would get your prayers, and he would write in your prayers, put your check in there, and said that the problem is somebody went out to the dumpster and found all the prayers in the dumpsters, but without the checks. And that was the end of Robert Tilton.
It's kind of coming back. I mean, when I hear like Osteen and
Well, now Osteen he participates in the in-your-face version of that. Joel Osteen does preach a prosperity. God wants you to be rich. Okay, Tilton, and he's one of these ones that will take certain pericopes and then squeeze them together to make a new message. I mean, I can make the Bible say anything I want the Bible to say. I'll take 2 sentences here, 4 sentences there, 5 sentences there, and it's still the Word of God. Okay, right? It's the Word of God. But Osteen does that. But what Tilton did was he took one of the Psalms, a phrase from the Psalms, to pay on your vows. Pay on your vow, which is a very obscure passage that comes from, and it's even Jews today look at that and go, oh, that came from Babylonian influences after the Second Temple. But he takes that all out of context and says, if you promise to do this, God will do that, but you got to pay. It costs you something. You have to pay on your vow. And so people will, well, the Bible says, so therefore I will. So they play on bibliolatry. A lot of the prosperity ministers play on the concept of bibliolatry, which is, if the Bible says it, it's therefore true, therefore I must do it. However, how much out of context it is, or misread or misapplied as those passages are. Anyway.
thank you.
Probably a subject for another night too, but I'm surprised you didn't mention anything about Vatican II. And
I'm getting there. Vatican II is next week.
Okay.
In fact, I gave you a hint. I said, what's the difference? And I used 1960.
Yeah.
Marlene caught on that one. Yeah. I think the final chapter has not been written on the Second Vatican Council. There was a book I have that was published in the late 60s. It's called The Montinian Church. It's about that thick. And it was about how Paul VI reinvented Catholicism. And of course, out of that comes the whole Latin Mass movement, and that which is gaining a great deal of popularity today, for reasons I don't think have anything whatsoever to do with religion. It has much more to do with novelty. There's no nostalgia involved, because nobody it goes to those is old enough to have remembered. If they had ever been to the Latin Mass when they were younger, they wouldn't want any part of that today. How many of you remember the old Latin Mass? How many of you would love to go back to that? Well, but see, here's the thing. When the Latin High Mass was done well, and it was almost never done well, and it was never done at all in rural towns, especially in Texas, because it took 4 priests together to sing High Mass. Yeah. Where were you going to find 4 priests to come together on a Sunday morning? We're all out. So all you got on Sunday morning was low Mass. You had 3 different kinds of Masses. You had low Mass, Missa Cantata, that is low Mass with music, or High Mass. And High Mass was encountered, you might get that once a year when the bishop came, and you could get priests from other parishes to come, confirmation, for example. Otherwise, and people wouldn't tolerate High Mass because it was an hour and 45 minutes long. And it required a choir. And if your choir was anything like the choir I grew up with, you couldn't take an hour and 45 minutes of that. 9 people strangling cats up in the choir loft.
But for instance, sometimes on Sundays, you or Father Barry, we will sing the Agnus Dei, which is beautiful, and I love it.
Okay, there's a difference between singing the parts of the Novus Ordo, which is fine, and you can do them in Latin. And then the Latin Mass Novus Ordo did not go away. It's just that nobody understands it.
Yeah, but in a few years, you're not going to have anybody in church singing because we're all gone.
Well, you have to ask the question, Who cares? I mean, seriously. If you sing Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, we know what you're talking about. You sing Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis, and the kids in the school are going to go, huh? Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth. Gloria in excelsis Deo, et in terra pax hominibus, bone voluntatis.
Yeah, I learned.
We learned that, yeah.
In Latin, and I loved it.
Andrew, how much of that do you remember?
I took Latin, so.
Smart kid. He took Latin. I don't deny the beauty of the Latin High Mass, but it's so rare. If you go to the London Oratory, for example, over in Chelsea, on Sunday morning, you will experience a Latin High Mass done flawlessly, but it's a theater piece. You're watching something happen, but you're not really engaged in it. And I think the Mass as it has been, that's why I'm going to talk about that later next week too. The Mass as we have it today, and the way that the Novus Ordo can be celebrated is both reverent and holy, but also in corporate engaging. So if you've ever gone to the 11 o'clock Mass here, that's what I'm talking about. That's what's called Reverent Novus Ordo. And it actually has a title, as it were.
Father, I take his follow with that. One of the best kept secrets. I'm not originally from Austin, but since I moved here, it's Vespers on Sunday evenings.
Vespers of St. Louis?
Yeah, another parish.
Yeah, that started out being Compline at 9 o'clock. And it was beautiful. And so I started Compline for the main reason of finding an opportunity to bring in people who don't go to church. Because Everett will remember this, I advertised it as a service in which you didn't have to say anything, nobody's going to preach, you can stand, sit, kneel, or lay on the floor for all we care. And it's just an experience. And it was done by candlelight and sung by a professional choir of men. And we sang the Order of Compline every Sunday night. And if it falls on Christmas night, we sang it on Christmas night. And after I left, the next pastor moved it to being Vespers. And it still attracts people today. Yeah.
I think people are looking for identity.
What people didn't realize is Compline cost $25,000 a year to put on. It wasn't cheap. Because, paid singers.
Okay.
But it was beautiful.
Yeah.
It is.
It's 8:30.
Okay.
Any other questions? No. Thank y'all so much. Fred, what?
You've put a lot of statistics up, but in the period from World War I to World War II, and particularly after World War II, technology was coming in both from the point of view of communications and also from transportation. We were able to move around a whole lot better, and we did, because we instead of being lucky to have one-car families, you had two-car families, and the kids had them, and they're going all over the place. So did that in any way change some of the things? I'm talking specifically about a time that I spent in the Cincinnati, Ohio area. Just across the state line in Indiana, there were two larger communities. Now this happened, and I got most of this from people who lived there. There was a good German community over here and a good French community over here, and because of all the wars between the two countries, they did not get along too well together. But after the war, whenever people were able to be a little bit more mobile and they had more TV and other kinds of things starting to come in, those German boys went over to the French guy, and hey, those French girls look pretty good over here, and then they would get the other way, and pretty soon those two communities are no longer...
I think, well, you're talking about Anderson and Lawrenceville.
Yes, I am. How did you get there?
I thought I made it pretty clear that I know everything. No. I went to graduate school in Indiana and Kentucky.
Okay.
And my cousins live in Cincinnati. So I know the area very well. So that's how I knew it.
You know those kinds of...
Well, that's true of all of southern Indiana is German Catholics.
Yeah.
All of it. There is a church in Jasper, Indiana, built by Mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Nobody knows this. In the 1860s, there's a Jasper, Indiana, a town you've never heard of, has a 1,000-seat church built by Mad King Ludwig of Bavaria. Anyway, it's really about urbanization, and I'm going to talk about that next week. Thank you all so much. God bless you. Thank you.